CNN and Fox have declared Joe Biden to be the president-elect, but is he the president-elect as a matter of law, as a matter of the Constitution? I'll explain why he is not. I'm also issuing a challenge on my show, an invitation to the senatorial candidate of the Democrats from Georgia, the Reverend Warnock, to come on this show and to explain his anti-Israel views and perhaps to modify them. And maybe I'll change my mind, because right now I have a conflict. As a Democrat, I want the Democrats to control the Senate. As a person who strongly supports Israel and American alliances with Israel, I'm strongly opposed to views he has expressed. So come on the show. The show can help resolve conflicts. I'll explain all of that and more on The Durr Show. Joe Biden is not the president-elect of the United States. He is not the president-elect as a matter of law. He is not the president-elect under the Constitution. He is the president-elect as the result of the election having been called by CNN and Fox and MSNBC and the various networks. But that has no effect whatsoever on the law. Let me explain to you what the law provides. There are statutes that talk about the transition. Now, the transition begins to operate the moment a nominee is officially nominated. So transition activities began for nominees back in May, June, July, August. Once the conventions officially nominated the two candidates, they both were entitled to certain benefits of the transition law. But the fact that the election has been conducted and that the various networks have called it for Joe Biden doesn't change the law at all. Absent a concession by the losing candidate, it's up to the General Administrative Services to determine when the person who has been called the winner becomes the actual president-elect and is entitled, as a matter of law, to certain financial benefits and intelligence benefits and other kinds of things. Look, Americans love certainty. And the moment the networks called it, I think it was on Saturday night, for Joe Biden, everybody, wow, he's the new president-elect. Foreign officials began to call him and congratulate him. And that's understandable because it's highly likely, absent some unanticipated circumstance, a judicial decision in Pennsylvania or in Nevada or in Georgia, recounts, absent some unanticipated circumstance, Joe Biden will become the president-elect when a sufficient number of states certify the results to assure that he will have 270 electoral votes. By the way, that doesn't assure it either, because under our Constitution, we can have faithless electors. A state may compel electors to vote for the winner, but they need not compel the electors to vote for the winner, and there are some states that don't. And so theoretically, and the law operates often on theoretical considerations, under the law, even if all the states were to certify enough votes for 270, that wouldn't make him officially the president-elect either, absent a concession, if those votes are being challenged. What makes him the president-elect officially is when the Electoral College gets together and votes for the president of the United States. And we know there have been problems in the past. Early in our history, Thomas Jefferson got enough electoral votes to be president, but so did Aaron Burr. And so they fought it out. If you've seen the musical Hamilton, you know how it ended. Similar actions occurred in the 1824 election between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. That one went to the House of Representatives. Others as well went to the House of Representatives. There were conflicts about the electors in the Tilden Hayes election. We've had those conflicts in the past, but the most recent precedent, obviously, is Bush versus Gore. And Al Gore, who I know and like very much, and I was part of the legal defense team. I represented the voters of Palm Beach County who were fooled into voting for Pat Buchanan by the butterfly ballot. That election was disputed. And nobody declared George W. Bush to be the president-elect until the Supreme Court rendered its decision. He claimed victory. Al Gore more or less claimed victory. Both sides had transition teams operating because you have to be prepared. Now, there's nothing in the law that prohibits the person who thinks he won the presidency, or indeed the person who lost the presidency but thinks he may win on a challenge. Nothing stops them from doing transition work, appointing committees, getting briefings, having candidates for various cabinet positions come to see them. That's all informal, and that operates outside of the law. But the law, there are several statutes about transition, one enacted as recently as 2019, provide for specific legal reactions to a person being named president-elect, and those don't come into play just as a result of the election being called. So when you hear the term president-elect, understand that it's not a legal term, it's not a constitutional term. It is just the media saying we were right and we anticipate he will be the president. So we're calling him the president-elect, and Angela Merkel is calling and congratulating him, and Benjamin Netanyahu is calling and congratulating him, and Boris Johnson is calling and congratulating him. They all assume he will be the president. And that's fine. They have the right to do that or not to do that as they choose. Some foreign leaders have not called because they are waiting to see what the results of the challenges are, and they don't want to be caught out there congratulating the wrong person. I don't think they have any problem. I think that, again, absent some unanticipated result on January 20th, we will see the inauguration of Joe Biden. But again, he's not necessarily, at this point in time, the president-elect. Does that mean that Secretary Pompeo was right when he, I think, as a quip, and I don't think he meant it seriously, but when he said, yeah, we're working on the transition to a second term for President Trump. Of course he's going to say that. He is a political person. He was appointed by the president. He's on the president's side. I'm sure in his conversations with foreign leaders, he's not saying that as a serious matter of state policy. He's a politician, and as a politician, he's siding with the president and saying that the president is going to be reelected. I'm sure he knows the reality and the uphill fight the president has to be reelected. But there's nothing wrong with doing that as a matter of law. He hasn't violated any law. There's a more difficult question as far as Attorney General Barr is concerned. Attorney General Barr has issued a statement authorizing the Justice Department to begin investigations based on credible evidence. Question is, what is credible evidence? Should the Justice Department be taking a position when the election has still not been resolved, at least in the mind of President Trump? Should they be staying out of it? Should they be waiting until the states have declared? Those are all good and reasonable questions. A Justice Department official didn't resign from the Justice Department, but resigned from the part of the Justice Department that deals with elections and protest over that decision. And I think reasonable people could say that the perception of fairness and the perception of objectivity by the Justice Department should have required them to remain silent during the period of time when there's still a conflict over who the president-elect actually is. Whether there'll be any investigations, I don't know. At the moment, I haven't seen the physical evidence, the retail evidence that would demonstrate massive voter fraud. As I've said from the very beginning, there has never been an election in American history, never been an election that hasn't had some fraud. And so when CNN stands up there in its pompous, arrogant, self-righteous way, lies to the American public and says, there is not a single instance of voter fraud, there has been no voter fraud, just don't believe them. They are exaggerating as much as any other network. Of course there's voter fraud. I guarantee you there were fraudulent ballots filed in Philadelphia, in Detroit, in New York, in Las Vegas. I guarantee it. There's no doubt about it. The question is how many? And the question is, were they part of a pattern or were they just individuals? It used to be the machine in Chicago would go around to cemeteries and write down the names. In Boston, too, the dead people, recently deceased people, and vote them. If that is true, that's a serious question, particularly if it involves a number of votes that could make the difference in an election. And if you don't think votes can make a difference in the election, just go back to Florida, where under 600 votes decided who the president of the United States would be in the face of an election where more than 600 people had their vote denied them because of the butterfly ballot, and they ended up voting for the person they didn't want to vote for, and because of voter suppression, which we knew took place in Florida on a relatively wide-scale basis. Those are the things we ought to be looking at: voter suppression, systemic fraud, machine computer glitches that could result in 6,000 votes being shifted from one side to the other. Those are the things we ought to be looking at. Or problems of constitutional law, such as allegedly occurred in Pennsylvania when ballots were counted that were received after the close of Election Day based on a Supreme Court decision of the state of Pennsylvania rather than a legislative decision. Those are all good issues to look at. And I praise the lawyers who are looking at those issues. They should not be condemned. They should not be blackballed. They should not be subject to McCarthyism the way some of them are. They're lawyers. They're doing their job under the Constitution. They should be praised for doing their job. And I'm sure they're giving advice to their client. And lawyers serve a very important function when they litigate contested issues of law, contested issues under the Constitution. So I think we're seeing exaggerations on both sides. Let's get back to what the law really says. Joe Biden will probably be elected by the Electoral College and will probably be inaugurated on January 20th. But he's not there yet. He is there for purposes of us making decisions. If I have to make a decision for a client based on who I think the president will be, or if I have to make economic decisions, investments in the stock market, whether I'm going to buy gold, whether I'm going to do, I have a right to decide who the next president's going to be, and my decision would be that it's going to be Joe Biden, because that's what the numbers are pointing to. But neither I nor CNN nor Fox has the right to have that decision, personal in nature or media or political in nature, determine the law. We have laws for a reason, and the transition laws come into operation when certain hallmarks are passed. The Government Services, General Services Administration has to make a preliminary decision. The states have to certify the votes. The electors have to gather. They have to vote. Congress has to certify those votes, and then the person becomes the president-elect and then the president of the United States. So let's be careful the way we talk about these issues. Let's not exaggerate on either side. We're going to see in the next few weeks more and more challenges. My prediction is that some will succeed, some will not. I don't believe there will be enough challenges to overturn the presidential election. I think there may be sufficient challenges to require recounts in one state or another, to discount a certain number of ballots in one state or another. Maybe Pennsylvania will see a massive number of votes discounted if they were received after the close of business on Election Day. But I don't think it's going to determine the outcome of the election. Could be wrong. And because I could be wrong, and because CNN and Fox could be wrong, that's why we don't officially declare a president-elect as an official government position until all these issues are resolved. So take a deep breath. It's going to take a little bit more time. Move on with your lives. Wear your masks. Deal with the growing pandemic, which is only getting worse and worse every day. Isolate, separate yourself by 6 or 10 feet. Do whatever you have to do. Object to the outcome of the election. Complain about the outcome of the election. Campaign in Georgia to see who controls the Senate. Go on with your life, but don't act as if we have an official president-elect And don't complain about lawyers who are taking on the important job of challenging election results. Don't complain about politicians who espouse views consistent with the views of their president or their party. It's politics. Secretary Pompeo has the same free speech rights you do. Attorney General Barr is in a different position. He is the chief legal officer of the United States, and reasonable people could disagree about whether or not authorizing investigations at this point in time is or is not the right thing. I'm sure he's getting advice from the Office of Legal Counsel, which is the kind of intellectual branch of the Justice Department, and I'm sure there's precedent one way or the other, but we are entitled to criticize. But all eyes now focus on Georgia, and I've expressed views on Georgia. I'm very, very conflicted, and I've asked for your help in resolving my conflict. I'm conflicted because the Democratic nominee who can turn the Senate over to the Democrats has a record of anti-Israel activities and other radical activities, which I don't myself support. There's been a lot of debate about that, and I'm waiting to hear whether he changes his mind and expresses more moderate, more centrist views and more views consistent with American policy toward Israel. I hope I don't have a conflict between my party support. I am, as I said, a liberal but not radical Democrat. I'm a centrist Democrat, and therefore my inclination is to hope that the Senate is under the control of centrist, moderate Democrats, but I could never support a candidate who's made some of the statements that Reverend Warnock has made. So I'm waiting to hear more from you on that before I make up my mind. I'm also giving him an opportunity to renounce his prior views, explain that he shouldn't have signed that letter. He shouldn't have given a sermon in which he talked falsely about Israeli soldiers shooting down innocent children like birds of prey. That's just false. It's just a lie. It's a blood libel, essentially. And I hope he renounces those views. But if he doesn't, I have a conflict. And look, America is a land of conflict. It's not easy. No president is perfect. No party is perfect. You got to always balance the imperfections versus the benefits and vote. We did that on November 3rd. We know what the result is likely to be. We know that there'll be a transition and transition offices open at some point. We know that the next president will be well prepared to assume his duties on January 20th. It's not like in the past where presidents came to Washington having done nothing to prepare. They started work on the day they were inaugurated. We now have a tradition of beginning and having a transition team. Former Vice President Biden has a transition team. They are working. He has a transition chairman. They are considering cabinet appointments. I hope the appointments will be centrist and not radical. I hope the radical elements of the Democratic Party, the hard left, are marginalized by this president. This president has a mandate in the center. He was nominated over radicals on the left because of his centrism. In my view, he was elected because of his centrism, because he rejected radicalism. As he said when he was asked about socialism, he said, hey, I beat the socialists. I won against them. I won against Elizabeth Warren. I won against Bernie Sanders. I won against the extreme left. He's at the center. So I'm hoping we'll see a peaceful transition. We'll see a move to the center. We'll see a presidency that will be good for America and good for the world. But stay tuned. We're going to have conflicts. We're going to have arguments. We're going to have debates. We're going to have, the mere fact that one party may have won the election, it's a very divided party, just like we're a divided country. And so stay tuned to The Durr Show. You will always hear about these divisions. You'll hear an honest analysis of both sides of every issue on The Durr Show. Let me end this segment by issuing a polite challenge to the Reverend Warnock. Please, come on this show. Discuss your views with me. You don't have to call it a debate. It can be a reasonable discussion. Let me ask you some questions about your trip to Israel, about why you signed that letter, about why you used some of the language you used, about where you got this false information that Israeli soldiers deliberately and willfully target Palestinian children to kill them. I want to know more about your views. So, yeah, I issue a challenge or an invitation. Come on the show. Let's have a discussion. Let's have a debate. The end result may be I'll support you. The end result may be I won't support you. But at least I want to give you a chance to explain to my listeners and viewers why they should support your candidacy for the United States Senate, which may determine who controls the United States Senate for the next several years. And now we'll turn to our listeners and our viewers, and I need your advice on some of these issues. As I've always said when I finish teaching class, a good class is when I learn something from my students. And for me, a good show is when I learn something from my listeners. So let's turn to the listeners and viewers now. Our first call today is from Chaim. What's your point?
I'd like to know if the actual Trump administration is able to prove serious fraud, one that would affect the election, if the Supreme Court would have the backbone, I guess, or the ability to overturn it, or it would be too much to overturn an election. They just wouldn't be able to do it. So that's my first part of my question. And the second part is, considering that there's now a conservative majority, 6-3, do you think that if they choose not to overturn the election, that would help with the healing process? Because now you have a 6-3 majority on the court that everybody knows is conservative saying, no, guys, this is over. Would that help?
That's a great question. I'll turn to the second one first. I do think that if the Supreme Court, appointed by this president, 3 justices, and with a strong 6-3 or at least 5-4 majority, were to say that the election's over, it would have a healing impact, probably. As far as fraud, the Supreme Court doesn't really have jurisdiction over fraudulent elections. That may sound strange, but fraud is a matter of state law. Obviously, if the fraud involved racial issues or gender issues or constitutional issues, that would bring it to the Supreme Court. But pure and simple fraud, dead people voting, unless they could construct an equal protection argument of the kind they did in Bush versus Gore, that's largely a matter of state law, not federal law. Okay, here's our next call.
Hey, Alan, how are you doing? I was a couple questions today. First of all, my first question is regarding Joe Biden and the Middle East. I know that you came out against Iran. You wrote a whole book about it. And I was wondering, there's been a lot of speculation that since Joe Biden is more pro-Iran, that first of all, he's going to get back into the Iran deal, and I think he's even said as much. So, I guess on that regard, do you think that despite him saying that since Trump has sort of changed the status quo and there's probably not so much, public support or public interest in him going back into the Iran deal, that he's necessarily going to do that, or maybe the status quo will just hold up? And on that same note, do you think that Trump's Middle East re-engineering and not putting the Palestinians front and center, instead worrying about countries like Saudi Arabia being and like the UAE having peace with Israel, do you think that will still continue potentially because that's the way Trump set it up under the Biden administration, or will his actions, such as being more pro-Iran, just completely halt that and go back to what previously was the mess in the Middle East? Thank you.
Those are both great questions. Here is the danger. The danger is that there are people on the Democratic side who are close to Vice President Biden who will argue that we should go back to everything Obama did, that we should assume the last 4 years didn't happen, jump right back into the Iran deal, go right back to treating the Palestinians the way Biden treated them, the way Obama and Biden treated them in the previous administration, as the central actors in the Middle East conflict, and act as if nothing at all happened. There are people pushing in that direction. Professor Mearsheimer of Chicago, who was quoted in the New York Times yesterday, is basically pushing in that direction, as others are. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that Biden will get back in the Iran deal, but with some changes, expanding the time limits of the Iran deal, perhaps expanding the types of inspections. The goal is the same. Biden doesn't want Iran to become a nuclear power with a nuclear arsenal. And the question is what he does about it and how he gets back in the deal. I think the same thing is true of the progress that's been made under President Trump with normalization with the Gulf states. That will continue. That's in the interest of the United States to continue that. And that will be done over the strong objections of Iran. I don't believe that Joe Biden is pro-Iran. I think that that Secretary Kerry, John Kerry, could be characterized as somewhat more sympathetic to Iran than he should have been. But I don't think that's true of Joe Biden. I think he'll be tough with Iran. And being tough with Iran is two things. One, changing the deal, and two, increasing normalization between Israel and the Gulf states, which is good for Israel, good for the United States, good for the Gulf states, and bad for Iran. It's a great question. Hey, Sam, you're from Florida. What's your point?
You say that you're a liberal Democrat and would normally be happy to have the Democrats rule the Senate, the House, and the presidency. You then say that you feel conflicted because of the new Democratic Party opposing Israel and just free speech in general. Why are you such a staunch Democrat? Why did you switch to the Republican or just be independent and judge each candidate and their policy on their own, as opposed to judging them by their party? Thank you.
It's a great question. I'm asked that question all the time. I remain a Democrat. I've always been a Democrat because I want to influence the Democratic Party toward the center and away from extremes. If I lose the ability to have that influence at all, I might very well become an independent. I threatened to quit the Democratic Party when they were about to nominate for the head of the party a man with a long history of association with anti-Semitism, and they didn't elect him. And so I remained in the Democratic Party. I do pick my candidates based on their advantages and disadvantages. I don't vote based on my party affiliation. Control of the Senate's a different matter because control of the Senate means that health care might go through, environmental issues might go through. There might be more of an ability to appoint moderate and liberals to the United States Supreme Court. So there are good reasons why a liberal Democrat might want the Democratic Party to control the Senate, but not at the cost of electing a senator whose views are so totally incompatible with the center of the Democratic Party, American values, and American alliances with Israel. So I remain conflicted, but great question. Our next call is from Ohio. Lawrence?
My question is in regards to now that Joe Biden is the president of the United States of America. He has campaigned with the promise to make a national mandate of masks, and I'm wondering, A, if that's constitutional or not, and B, whether that would actually help. What you think would actually help? Would that help the spread of the novel coronavirus, or would just people be resentful of it and come out in mass protest? Thank you very much. Have a good one.
I appreciate that. I think it would help. I think if everybody wore masks, we could really reduce the spread of the illness. I wrote about that back in March when health officials were saying don't buy masks because they have to be reserved for first responders. I said get masks, and it is airborne, and I wrote about that. So I strongly believe that masks will help. The president has no authority to order anybody to wear a mask. We have to emphasize this over and over again. The president is not the commander-in-chief, period. He is the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces. The president cannot tell you or me what to do. The president can't come up to you and say, wear a mask. You can say to him, buzz off, buddy. I don't want to wear a mask. You have no obligation to listen to anything the president says. He has no legal authority over any of us. Only the legislature make laws. The executive branch enforces the laws. So if we're going to have a national mandate to wear masks, it has to come from the legislature. It can't come from the president. Now, the president does have executive authority. Often it's been misused. President Roosevelt, in my view, violated the law and the Constitution by ordering the confinement of 110,000 Americans of Japanese descent and putting them in detention centers. That was an abuse of power. The Supreme Court didn't agree with me. They now agree with me. They admit they were wrong about that. But presidents, governors, mayors are executive officials. They don't make the law, they enforce the law. If the legislature passed a national mandate to require the wearing of masks, that would go to the Supreme Court. It would be a close case, but I think it would be upheld because the coronavirus is an interstate issue. Viruses don't respect state borders or boundaries, and so I think, although it's a close case, it would be upheld, as I think mandatory vaccinations, if a safe and effective vaccine were found, would also be upheld by the Supreme Court. Our next call is from Oklahoma. Johnny.
If the Democrats take the Senate, when it comes to Israel, it'll be like it was once before. They'll be dropped. All the power will be given to the countries surrounding Israel, and they will take over Israel. They'll come across there like fire ants on a chicken. It's going to get bad. The talk's already out there. I mean, war's coming to this world. We're not going to get away from it. Not after the stunt that these Democrats have actually pulled, and the world's watching everything going on. They know exactly who they can purchase, who they can buy to get their foot into the door now. So we've got a lot of problems here. I'm from Oklahoma. You know, we are Trump followers here. And we stay pretty calm through everything, but no. If he gets into office, we won't follow his rule. He will never be our president in this state. No, sir. No way, no how. But, yeah, Israel will fall if that demonic, demonized, socialist, Democratic Party gets into that office, period.
Well, thanks for your call. Joe Biden will be my president if he is inaugurated, just like Donald Trump was my president. Even though I voted against him in 2016, he was my president because I respect the will of the people. Israel will not fall. Israel is strong enough and powerful enough at the moment to defeat militarily all of its collective enemies, in part as the result of American military assistance, in part as a result of Israel developing its own nuclear capacity, its own technological capacity. Israel's only existential threat comes from Iran. And if Iran were to be permitted to develop nuclear weapons, that would pose a major existential threat to Israel. But I don't think Israel would allow that to happen. I think it would do whatever it took to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear arsenal, provided they knew about it. Iran operates a lot in secret. That's what I didn't like about the Iran deal. I wrote a book against it. And I am hopeful that whatever Joe Biden does, the deal with Iran will prevent it from developing a nuclear arsenal. And if the United States doesn't do that, Israel will have no choice but to, on its own, destroy the capacity of Iran to develop a nuclear arsenal. After all, the former head of Iran, Rafsanjani, said that if Iran developed a bomb and they dropped it on Tel Aviv, that would be the end of Israel. It would kill 3 million Jews and mark the end of Israel. And then he said Israel would retaliate and drop a bomb on Tehran and kill 20 million Muslims. And he said that trade-off would be worth it. It would end Israel, the small Satan, the Jewish state, but Islam would continue. When you have a leader of a country making apocalyptic statements like that and threatening to destroy a country, you have to take it seriously. As Elie Wiesel once said, the lesson of the Holocaust is always believe the threats of your enemies more than the promises of your friends. And so Israel has to believe the threats of Iran, and it can't believe the promises of its friends, even close friends like America. It has to rely on its own strength, and thankfully it has the strength, with great sacrifice, to be able to prevent its own destruction. So I think Israel will survive. I think the United States will survive and thrive. And Joe Biden will be my president if he is inaugurated on January 20th. That doesn't mean I'm going to vote for him if he runs again. I'm going to wait and see how he does over the next 4 years. That's what I do as a Democrat who is independent. I look to see how the president did. I voted for Barack Obama twice. I have had second thoughts about my second vote for him, and perhaps I should have voted for Mitt Romney the second time. I'm still uncertain about my vote. I thought he would do much better on foreign policy than he did, and I know that Joe Biden has a lot more experience in foreign policy from his Senate work than President Obama did when he came to office, and I hope that will show in his foreign policy decisions. So I'm going to look hard and be critical and be cautious and express my criticisms on the Durr Show, even if it's a president who's a Democrat. Okay, our last call this morning is from Phil in Colorado.
Thank you for taking my call. It's a great honor to have this opportunity to present my question to you. I recently heard your podcast that discusses voter fraud and voter suppression. I absolutely appreciate hearing your views, as they do differ from mine somewhat. What I'd like to ask is how one of those can be more serious than the other. Now, I can understand if voter rules require a complex registration process and narrow time frame to complete them, things like that, as that can be a good example of voter suppression. However, if, say, for example, my neighbor illegally casts 2 votes to my 1, presuming that he had voted for issues or candidates that are not mine, well, now, how is now my vote is not only suppressed by his illegal vote, but if he isn't punished, now I'm getting the message that my vote is immaterial, and thus I am now disenfranchised on top of the illegal vote. So I'd just like your views on that, and I sure appreciate this time. Again, Professor, thank you, and I love your show.
Well, thanks. That's a very, very good question. Of course, you're right. If there is voter fraud and somebody gets to vote twice, that discounts your vote, or if somebody dead gets to vote, that weakens, waters down your vote. The point I was making is that voter suppression tends to be more widespread and tends to be often based on racial and ethnic characteristics, that voter suppression tends to take place more in certain areas among certain groups than other groups, and it's more wholesale than retail. And the numbers, I think, are greater. But if you were able to persuade me that voter fraud was endemic and systemic and involved many, many more people than voter suppression, I would have to agree with you. So it's not that one thing is worse than the other. It's that voter suppression is more common, is more racially oriented, and is more widespread historically than fraud has been. If that were to change, my views would change. So thank you so much for your great questions, all great questions today. I'm still looking for advice as to how I should deal with the senatorial candidate from Georgia. I hope some of you will call in and give me your advice on that. I have invited him, the Reverend Warnock, to join me on this show. I hope he will take me up on that, and then we will all have an opportunity to make a judgment. That's what this show is about, getting the facts, giving you the law, and letting you make up your mind on the Durr Show. You'll never be bored. An important part of the Durr Show is your voice, your questions, your comments. Please call 24/7. The number is 216-710-0050. Keep your comments short and to the point. Again, the number for you to call 24/7 is 216-710-0050. Hard questions, criticisms, everything's fine. Just keep your questions short, and I'll answer them all on the Durr Show.